The wind had a way of dragging the dust along the main street of Bitter Springs. It clawed at the saloon doors, scoured the splintered wood of the sheriff's office, and whipped the sweat and grit into the eyes of anyone foolhardy enough to linger outside. The town smelled of sun-baked hay, horse sweat, and the acrid tang of gunmetal. For a man like Silas Creed, it was familiar. Too familiar. He pulled the brim of his hat lower and squinted at the horizon where the desert rolled. Like an endless sea of burnt ochre and bone-colored rock, he rode slow, horses' hooves stirring dust in little puffs, as if even the ground feared to make a sound under him. Silas didn't talk much. Never had. Folks said he carried the silence of a grave with him, and maybe they were right. He was lean, all muscle, and quiet resolve, with lines in his face like a map of the places he'd been and things he'd done. Things he'd rather forget. But it wasn't the past he was thinking about today. It was the sound of a woman's scream that brought him to Bitter Springs. Not a long scream, not one meant to attract attention from far off. A small, raw sound that cut through the morning haze like a knife. He tethered his horse outside the saloon. Inside, the smell of stale beer and sweat hit him immediately. The piano had long since gone silent, leaving only the soft scrape of boots on wood and the low murmur of conversation. He noticed her then, sitting in the corner, knees pulled, tight to her chest, hands bruised and trembling. Her hair was tangled, a dark halo around a face, pale from fear. Eyes too wide and too wild for the quiet morning. "You all right there, miss?" he asked, voice low. The words sounded strange to him, like he hadn't spoken them in years. She looked at him, hesitant, like she wasn't sure if the voice belonged to a friend or a threat. "They're going to sell me," she whispered, almost to herself. Silas frowned. He'd seen the world's cruelest corners, but this he didn't have a name for it yet. He only knew the heat rising in his chest. A slow, deliberate fire. "Who?" he asked. She swallowed hard. "The sheriff. The men in the back. They auctioned me. They." Her voice caught, trembling. Silas didn't move. He didn't yet know what he would do, only that he could not leave her. Moral calculus was simple, immediate, visceral. He rose and walked to the bar. The bartender, a thick-set man with a scar running across one cheek, gave him a wary look. "Whiskey?" Silas said, sliding a silver coin across. "You don't look like the kind to pour it." The glass hit the wood with a soft thud. Silas drank it down in a single motion, letting the burn chase the dust from his throat. Then he turned back to her. "Listen," he said, low, "I can get you out of here." "But you gotta trust me," she nodded, trembling, hesitant, but nodding all the same. By noon, they were outside. The town's heat was brutal, the sky a hard, blinding blue. Silas led the woman to his horse. She climbed with difficulty, shivering. From more than the chill of fear, Silas lifted her into the saddle ahead of him, then swung up behind. The horse started, muscles rippling under hot sun. They didn't speak for miles. Only the wind, the slap of horse hooves on dirt, the distant cries of hawks overhead. Silas remembered the last time he had felt something like this, years ago. In a town burned to ashes by men like the ones who had cornered her. He had watched, helpless, as they took what he could not protect, and for years afterward, he had walked the frontier carrying the weight of that failure. This time, he swore to himself it would be different. They reached a ridge overlooking the town. Bitter Springs lay behind them, small, cruel, baking under the sun. Silas held the reins loosely, letting the horse graze. He looked at her then. He asked, "Clara," she said. "Clara," he repeated, tasting the name. "You from here?" She shook her head. "No, from the east. My father. He was a farmer. They bandits came, killed him, took everything. Then I thought maybe there was safety here. I was wrong." Silas nodded slowly. He understood that kind of loss more than she could know. "What do you want to do?" he asked. She looked at him, eyes bright with tears. "Live," she said, simply. Silas allowed himself a small, nearly imperceptible smile. The journey that followed was long and dangerous. Bitter Springs was a small town, but it had powerful men who were not used to being denied. They trailed them for days, Silas always finding ways to lose their scent. The dry washes, the gullies, the thickets of mesquite along the way. Clara began to speak in fits and starts, telling him stories of her life, of her hopes and fears. Silas listened, rarely speaking, letting her words fill the silences he could not. One night, they camped under a sky crowded with stars. The fire was low, the air sharp with cold. Clara sat close, wrapping herself in a blanket, staring into the flames. "Do you ever forgive yourself?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely a whisper. Silas looked at her, firelight dancing across his face. "Sometimes," he said finally. "Sometimes I try." She nodded, unsure if his answer was confession or deflection, and in that quiet, as the desert night hummed with unseen life, Silas realized something he hadn't in years. That redemption was not something you waited for. It was something you acted on, even if the world tried to stop you. The final confrontation came in the canyon outside town. The sheriff, fat with greed and flush with the confidence of corrupt men, had sent 3 riders to bring Clara back. Silas faced them in the narrow pass, horse snorting, dust swirling at his boots. The men laughed, pistols raised. "You can't." "Take her," one of them sneered. Silas said nothing. He didn't need to. His hand hovered near his holster, steady, patient. And then the first shot rang out. Time slowed. Dust and smoke and gunmetal filled the air. Silas moved with a calm, lethal precision born of years surviving the worst. When it was done, the 3 men lay in the dirt, groaning, and he stood alone, breathing heavily, watching the canyon swallow the echoes. Clara stepped closer, hands trembling, eyes wide. "Why?" she asked. Silas let out a breath, finally allowing himself to show the faintest trace of emotion. "Because no one should own you," he said. She stared at him, at the quiet, haunted man who had crossed the desert for her, and for the first time since she could remember, felt a flicker of safety. They rode into the next town together, dusty, exhausted, but alive. Silas led the horse slowly down the street, letting the people stare, letting the sun bake their clothes to their skin. Clara rode beside him, upright, head high, breathing the air of freedom for the first time in years. He knew their journey wasn't over. There would be more dangers, more choices, more nights under stars, too cold for sleep. But for now, he allowed himself a small, quiet satisfaction that he had done the right thing, even if the world didn't know it. And Clara, for her part, learned to trust the silence of a man who had seen too much, and yet still acted when it mattered most. The wind carried the dust along the streets as they disappeared over the horizon, and somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of a piano, long silent, began to play again. The next morning, Silas and Clara camped near a dry wash, the sun climbing in a haze of heat and shimmering dust. Water was scarce. The horse, a dark bay with a white blaze, pawed the hard dirt impatiently, tail flicking away flies. Clara moved, slowly collecting what little firewood they could find. Her hands bore bruises that Silas had long ago stopped asking about. Pain was a language she had learned to speak without words. Silas watched her, squatting low, hands resting on his knees. There was something delicate about her movements, the way she balanced careful strength and exhaustion. He had seen women like her before, women who had been ground down by the world, but who carried within them a spark no amount of cruelty could kill. "You need to rest," he said finally. Clara shook her head. "We can't stop. They'll catch us if we linger." He let the words hang between them. The truth was simple. She was right. But for all the running, there had to be a moment of pause. "I'll rest if you rest," he said. "Not a word more. Until sun sets." She looked at him, suspicion curling at the edges of her eyes, but nodded. The days that followed were a rhythm of heat, dust, and the quiet terror of being hunted. They moved through the canyons and scrublands, staying off the main trails, sleeping under rocky outcrops. Silas rarely spoke, but his eyes never left the horizon. Every ridge, every gully, every copse of mesquite was a potential trap. One evening, as the sun bled red into the western sky, Clara finally broke the silence. "Do you ever think about going back?" she asked, voice small, hesitant. Silas didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. The desert seemed to breathe around them, the rocks warm from the day, the wind soft against their faces. Finally, he said, "Back where? To your life before all this. Your ranch, your town, the people you left behind." He frowned. "There ain't no going back. Not for me." She nodded, accepting the words, but her eyes lingered. He could see the question in her gaze. Why keep moving if nothing waits at the end? He didn't answer. Some questions weren't meant for answers. They were meant to remind you why you kept going. They crossed a small creek one morning. The water was cold, biting against skin long hardened by sun and wind. Clara drank greedily, cup cupped in her hands, eyes closing in brief relief. Silas watched her, and for the first time in days, allowed a memory to creep in unbidden. A girl in a white dress, hair tangled by the wind. Her father, a farmer, with lines etched deep from sun and soil. And then fire, screams. The smell of smoke and iron. He had tried to save them once, failed. The memory was a stone in his chest he carried every day. He shook it off, focusing on Clara. She was alive. That was enough. For now, by the fourth day, signs of pursuit grew closer. Smoke from a distant fire, hoof prints in the dirt. Silas set up a makeshift trap, using the terrain to their advantage. When the riders appeared, 3 of them, dusty and sunburned, they rode straight into his plan. Silas didn't speak. He let them come. When they realized the canyon narrowed, horses sliding on loose rock, panic flickered in their eyes. Silas moved with quiet precision, shouting once only, a sound full of authority. "Stop!" The leader, a wiry man with a scar slicing across his jaw, sneered. "This don't concern you, stranger. Step aside." Silas shook his head. "It does now." Horses reared. Guns were drawn. And then, before the first shot could fire, Silas' horse leaped forward, knocking one man from his seat. Chaos erupted, dust and shouts and the smell of sweat and gunpowder. When the smoke cleared, 2 of the pursuers lay groaning, disarmed, and Silas had the last man's attention with a cold, steady hand on his revolver. "You leave now," Silas said, "and if you're foolish enough to come after her again, I won't wait." The man nodded, trembling, and rode off, leaving Clara and Silas alone in the quiet canyon. That night, they camped in a hidden alcove. Clara finally spoke freely, recounting the auction in Bitter Springs, the way the sheriff had smiled as he pounded the gavel, the way the townsfolk had jeered, indifferent, how she had felt as though the earth itself had turned against her. Silas listened, silent, his jaw tight, hands clasped over his knees. When she finished, he said nothing, but she understood his answer. He had acted. He had saved her. That was enough. Sleep came fitfully, broken by dreams of fire and blood, but also of quiet hands guiding hers, steady and warm. Weeks passed. They moved through the desert, the open plains stretching endless beneath the sun. Silas began teaching Clara small things: how to read the land, how to listen for signs of water, how to handle a gun without fear. She was hesitant at first, but the survival lessons became lessons in trust, and with trust came courage. One afternoon, they came upon a small settlement. Its buildings leaned wearily against the wind, the paint peeling, the boards warped. Children ran barefoot through the dust, laughing. The smell of fresh bread and livestock drifted from the few houses. Clara looked at Silas, hope flickering in her eyes. "This could be a place," she said. Silas nodded slowly. He had no illusions about the safety here, but for the first time, he allowed himself to imagine it, a place to stop running, even if only for a little while. But even here, the past was never far behind. The sheriff of Bitter Springs had not forgotten. Word traveled, as it always did in the West, carried by men greedy for coin and vengeance. One evening, a rider appeared, dust-choked and wild-eyed, bringing a warning. The sheriff and his men were coming. Silas prepared. There would be no hesitation this time. They fortified the settlement's small corral, whispered warnings to the townsfolk, and waited. When the men arrived, it was as if the heat itself had conspired with Silas. The sun fell low, casting long shadows across the plain. Guns flashed, horses screamed, men shouted. And through it all, Silas moved like a shadow, calculated and relentless, shielding Clara, guiding the townsfolk to safety, punishing those who had caused her suffering. Nightfall, the attackers had been routed. The sheriff lay captured, his smug authority replaced by fear. Silas did not kill him, but left him bound for the law to claim. Justice, he decided, was not vengeance, it was survival and accountability. Afterward, the town gathered around the fire. Clara stood beside Silas, dirt-streaked, hair tangled, bruises fading. For a long while, no one spoke. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the distant call of coyotes. Finally, Clara turned to him. "Why did you save me?" she asked. Silas looked at her, eyes weary but steady. "Because no one deserves to be owned," he said simply. "Because sometimes the world is cruel, and someone has to be good anyway." She nodded, not fully understanding, but feeling it nonetheless. The firelight caught the lines of his face, carved by years of hardship, and she saw the truth of it there. A man who had walked through hell and come out carrying nothing but the weight of his choices, and now, finally, something lighter. Days later, Silas and Clara rode out of the settlement, the wind carrying dust behind them. The horizon stretched infinite, as it always had, and for the first time in years, Silas felt a strange, delicate thing. Hope he didn't speak of the future, because the West was too uncertain for plans. But he allowed himself to imagine one, a life not ruled by past mistakes, not measured by losses, but by small acts of courage and kindness. By the knowledge that sometimes saving one life could redeem many more. Clara rode beside him, steady and alive, finally free. And Silas, the quiet cowboy with a haunted past, finally understood that redemption was not a destination, the choice to act every day. In a world that refused to be just, the wind swept across the plain, carrying dust, scent of sagebrush, and the faint echoes of a piano somewhere behind the horizon. And as they disappeared into the light of the late afternoon sun, the world seemed, for just a moment, a little less cruel, a little more human.